Ready.
Okay. And ready to do screen share? It says you've disabled it.
This settings have been all messed up. Let me try real quick how I do that on this device. Hold on. I think they redid Zoom and it messed up the settings. Let me see where it is.
Let me try it again.
I haven't found it quite yet. Hold on. Let me see if I can make you a co-host and then it should. Okay, now try.
Okay. There we go.
Perfect.
Okay, good deal. Okay, there we go. Well, welcome back. We are actually kind of finishing up the ancient history part in the Bible today. Not totally, as I'll explain here in a minute, but this is kind of the last section on Roman history, which kind of ends ancient history. And then after that, we're going to go back, as I was telling Rachel, we're going to go back for about 2 months and talk about the rise of the early Christian church. It's an extremely interesting topic. It's one which I have to admit most of us as Christians don't know a whole lot about. And, it's really important because that's where our church developed as an institution. And we're going to start off next week by looking at the historical Jesus, what history says about Jesus. And there's a lot more than you might believe. I know that we're all familiar with the Bible, but there's a lot of extant sources out there as well. But today we're going to talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire. Always an interesting subject because you invariably start thinking in your mind, I think I've heard some of this before. That's because history does indeed repeat itself. And I'm hoping it doesn't repeat itself too soon, but there is definitely some signs that some of the, indicators that we saw with the collapse of the Roman Empire and other empires throughout history are beginning to show its signs. So let's talk about this, the end of the Western Roman Empire. When Constantine died in 337, remember last week we talked about how Constantine became the first Christian Roman emperor of note, and he basically made Christianity legal. He brought it, into the fold where you didn't have to be worried about persecution anymore, at least from the Roman government. And so when he died in 337, the Roman Empire must have seemed pretty stable to most of its citizens. Constantine had brought a renewal and a stability to both the government and the economy. He had brought about a sense of peace with the legalization of Christianity. The religion appealed to the masses, to the disenfranchised, and it was a relief for the Christians finally to be able to worship their religion in the open without fear of reprisal, because that had been going on now for almost 300 years. And finally, the Christians were able to worship their religion fully and totally. But, however, as history tells us, sometimes things appear healthy on the surface, but on the inside, things are kind of tarnished. And so it was with the Roman Empire. In fact, had it not been for a few emperors who brought temporary stability to the empire after Constantine, the Roman Empire may well have fallen prior to 476 AD, which is the historical date that most historians rely upon as being the day when the Roman Empire fell. So what happened after Constantine? Well, for the next 24 years after he died, his 3 sons kind of split up the empire. That was kind of the way he had it planned. And he basically said, each one of you will have this area to rule. The problem is the 3 sons didn't get along. Each one wanted power over the other. And so it kind of developed into a civil war. And things began to kind of downward spiral after Constantine's death. Finally, in 361, the last son, Constantius II, died. And there was no more sons left. There was no more direct heirs to Constantine. So a second cousin by the name of Julian took over. Julian is often called Julian the Apostate. If you don't know what an apostate is, it's someone that basically denies the church. And he did indeed deny Christianity. He said, I'm not a Christian. Constantine was wrong. We are going to restore paganism to the empire. We're going to put everything back the way it was. We're going to disallow Christianity. Now, he didn't go all the way to the point of forbidding it, and he didn't go all the way of starting persecutions again. He was a little bit more subtle than that, because frankly, the Christians had grown so rapidly that I'm not sure he even thought he could have done that. But what he did do was try to pit the age-old enemy of the Christians and against each other, the Jews. And so basically, he basically started pitting these two groups against each other. He announced that he was going to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, not because he loved Judaism, but because he thought that that would invalidate the prophecy of the end times for Christians. He never got it started. In fact, he never even began to be built, because he only lived a couple of years. And when he died, he was the last non-Christian emperor of the Roman Empire. He was followed by a couple of guys, two brothers by the name of Valentinian and Valens. Valens ruled from the east, Constantinople, the new capital that Constantine had built. And Valentinian ruled from Rome. So they kind of redivided the empire again. They ruled for about 15 years. Valentinian finally died of a stroke in 375, and Valens died fighting off one of the barbarian tribes, the Goths, at the Battle of Adrianople in 378. That's a real turning point in history, because from this point on, you begin to see the real decline of the Western Roman Empire, the area we associate with Rome. The Eastern Roman Empire still remained strong for quite a while, as you'll find out. When Valens was killed, he was succeeded by Theodosius, who's considered to be the last great emperor to rule the combined Roman Empire. He tried to bring it back together. He tried the best he could, but for all practical purposes, he was a ruler from the east. And here's a map that shows where the Battle of Adrianople was in 378. And that's kind of a turning point in history. It's about 100 years yet before the Roman Empire falls, but you really begin to see the decline of the western part of the Roman Empire. But Theodosius hung on. He ruled from 346 to 395 AD, an extremely strong ruler. Pardon me, that was his dates of birth and death. He ruled from 379 to 395. He was a very strong ruler, and he tried his best to bring the empire back. And I think even he realized that basically the West was gone. So he tried to rule as much as possible from the east. He tried to save it. He wanted his two sons to take over, but that wasn't going to work. And by the end of the 380s, Triodosius had moved his court to Milan, Italy. He thought, if I move to the west, maybe I can get this thing going again. So he moved from Constantinople to Milan, Italy. And while he was there, he struck up a relationship with the bishop of Milan, a man by the name of Ambrose. Ambrose is one of the great church fathers of the Christian church. You'll find out about him in the next few weeks. He influenced Theodosius not only from a Christian point of view, but from a political point of view. You will see that in the Christian church, starting in the 300s and 400s, the Bishop of Rome becomes more and more as much of a political leader as he is a religious leader. And it's at this point that Ambrose really begins to exert the church's authority over the temporal leaders. So what did Theodosius do? Well, first of all, he helped forge the Christian theology of consubstantiality, being of one substance of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, this had supposedly been settled back in 325 at the Council of Nicaea. And again, we're going to talk more about this when we get into the history of the Christian church. But there were still a lot of people running around in the Roman Empire, Christians, called themselves Arians, and not Arians, Aryans, like we associate with Germany, but Arians, Arians. And he said basically, he issued an edict in 380, the Edict of Thessalonica, and he said only Christians who believe in the constantiality of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity as we know it, can style themselves as Catholic. This is when the church starts calling itself the Catholic Church. Catholic means universal. Up to this point, it had just been a Christian church. It had just been Christian, Jesus followers, the way, whatever you want to call it. All of a sudden now you begin to say, if you want to believe in the Holy Spirit like we do, and the total one substance of the Trinity, then you are a Catholic. You belong to the universal church. Otherwise, you're outside the boundaries of doctrine. So that's when we start thinking of the church as the Catholic Church from this point on. He was a very pious man. He did everything he could. There is a real important story that during his reign, there had been a massacre at Thessalonica by his army. He had not participated in it, had not ordered it, but his army ended up massacring a whole bunch of people at the town of Thessalonica. And when Ambrose found out about it, he basically kicked Theodosius out of the church. He said, I refuse to give you the communion, the Eucharist, until you basically do penance. And so for several months, Theodosius was not allowed to enter the church. He was not allowed to participate in the Eucharist, which was done every week at this point in time. And he basically was told, you're not a member of the church. Finally, Theodosius, the story goes, put on sackcloth, got on his hands and knees and crawled into the church. This is the Roman emperor. He crawled into the church before Ambrose, begging his forgiveness. And Ambrose forgave him, let him partake in the Eucharist. And at this point, you begin to see the bishops of the church becoming more and more powerful, not just religious, but politically. So anyway, Theodosius dies in 395. He was succeeded by his sons, and they were weak. They could not hold it together. And once they died, you have just had a series of what's called puppet emperors. They were weak. In fact, some of them were actually barbarians from the northern tribes. And really, Theodosius is considered to be the last great emperor of the Roman Empire. And this is Theodosius paying homage to Ambrose, somebody's idea of medieval painting or Renaissance painting of this going on. So, barbarians at the gates. Now, we've alluded to this, but we're going to talk more about it right now. From about 200 on, the Roman Empire had been challenged by a group of German peoples on the northern frontiers, which finally end up resulting in the destruction of the Western Roman Empire in 476. By the 4th century, the pressure of the Germanic advance was being felt on Rome's frontiers, and it was increasing significantly. So these tribes up in the north, what we now call Germany and France, and all these areas, the areas up north of the Danube River, they were putting pressure upon the Western Roman Empire, not so much the eastern part of the empire, but the western part. Basically, they were invading the empire. And they were kind of two different types of Germanic tribes, barbarians, and that's what they're called. That's not a very appropriate term anymore, but I'm going to stick with it because that's what history says they were. There were basically migrations of whole peoples with their Germanic organization intact. So there were some tribes that were putting pressure on the Roman Empire to challenge the Roman Empire, which were basically organized tribes. And these included the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals. That term is where we get the term vandalism and vandals, the Burgundians, and the Lombards. And you've probably heard of the Lombardy in Italy. That's where the Lombards come from. The Burgundians ended up in the southern part of Spain or France. And then there were also bands of immigrants in search of land to settle. And they basically were just warriors. They really didn't have any unified organization. These people were the Franks, which settled most of France, the Angles and the Jutes and the Saxons, which settled most of Britain. So basically, there were just barbarian tribes all over the northern part and putting the Roman Empire in jeopardy. In part, this happened because there were another group of barbarians called the Huns who lived in the southeastern part of Europe and Asia, that area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the steppes of Central Asia. And they were suffering a drought. And so they were forcing themselves to move westward into what we now call Europe, thus forcing the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Lombards, the Franks, the Angles, Jutes, and the Saxons south. So Attila the Hun was also in operation at this point in time. A lot of barbarian tribes putting pressure upon the Roman Empire. So several things happened, as you can see here, after the death of Theodosius I in 395. Just real briefly, 396, the Visigoths under Alaric ravaged Greece and settled in the northwestern part of the peninsula. So in 396, they basically took over northern Greece. In 402, the Visigoths also invaded northern Italy and was kind of held off, but they were still forcing themselves into Italy. 406, the Vandals had crossed the Rhine and overran the frontier. The Visigoths, again under Alaric, laid siege to Rome. They actually got all the way to the Roman gates and negotiated a peace with the Senate where they set up a puppet emperor, basically under control by the Visigoths, but still yet there was a Roman emperor as such. 409, the same year, the Vandals invaded Spain and took it over. And then they moved into Africa, northern Africa, and by 439, they had captured the old city of Carthage. So as you can see, this happened really, really rapidly. Once they broke through the gates, once they broke through the frontier, it was just a matter of you not being able to stop them, really. I don't know how they did there, though. Hang on. Okay. 476, the last Roman emperor sat upon the throne. Boy, what a name. I've always thought so appropriate. Romulus Augustus. I mean, this just sounds like a Roman emperor. Romulus, if you remember, was one of the co-founders of Rome. Romulus and Remus, his twin brother that was suckled by a wolf, according to tradition. And Augustus, of course, was the first Roman emperor. So here you've got the last Roman emperor by the name of Romulus Augustus, was disposed by the Roman army under Odoacer, who himself was a barbarian. Odoacer was a German, and he had taken charge of the Roman army, and he basically just overthrew the Roman emperor, declared himself the king of Italy, and effectively ended the Western Roman Empire. So 476 is generally given as the date for the fall of the Roman Empire. And here's a map that shows you kind of all these different tribes. You've got the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes up here invading Britain. You've got the Franks coming down into France. You've got the Goths coming down from the Scandinavian area over into this area. You've got the Visigoths in the purple, the Visigoths in the dark purple down here. And then you've got the Ostrogoths in the lighter lavender type in this area. And you've got the Huns in the green. Remember, that was Attila the Hun. And they basically came all the way into what we call now Europe. And then the Vandals, which went all the way through Spain, come into Carthage, and then spread out into the Mediterranean, even into Rome. So by 476, the western part of the Roman Empire, this part here, had pretty well gone. The Eastern Roman Empire was still intact and would be intact for another 1,000 years. We generally call it the Byzantine Empire. Now, there has been a whole science of the study of why did the Roman Empire fall. And there's been hundreds of books written about it. The classic was written by a man by the name of Edward Gibbon. He wrote a 6-volume history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. He was an 18th century historian, lived in the 1700s, and he spent his life studying why he thought the Roman Empire fell. And while some people no longer believe in all of his theory, it's still kind of the standard. So let's look at Gibbon a little bit. Gibbon was an English historian schooled in the age of the Enlightenment. This was this period of time after the Renaissance, when people just had kind of drifted away from the church and was basically thought it was the age of reason. Everything could be figured out by reason and rationale. He was a sickly youth and found his solace in books, particularly history. Went to Oxford University. When he got to Oxford University, he fell under the tutelage of a bunch of deist philosophers. Deists basically said there was a supreme being that didn't have anything to do with the world. They basically created and then just hands off. After that, they just left it alone. They didn't believe in the typical Christian ideas. So he got in there and he started really getting these ideas in his head. Now, his dad was an extremely religious man. When his father found out what was going on, he basically said, "You're coming out of there. I'm not going to let you stay in that university anymore." He pulled him out of Oxford, threatened to disown him if he didn't repent. He was a wealthy man. And sent him to Switzerland, where he supposedly reconverted to Protestantism under the guidance of a Reformed pastor. There's some doubts of whether or not he actually did get rid of his ideas, because you'll see these deist ideas followed through in his theory. After returning to England for a few years, he then traveled to France with, went to France and then made a trip to Rome with one of his young companions. And it's said that when he saw the ruins of Rome, he just knew that this was going to be his life, that he was going to write the causes of why this great empire fell. And that's what he did, folks. From 1776 to 1787, he basically wrote a 6-volume history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And it ruined his life. He was so thoroughly invested in this that it basically broke his health, and he died in 1794. It's interesting. Look at the dates of that, 1776 to 1787. Remember what was going on in England while he was writing this book. They were fighting the Revolutionary War. England was in the throes of its own beginning to decline. That wouldn't take place fully until the 1800s and actually beginning in the 1900s. But by 1900, the British Empire was on the decline for sure. So when he wrote this book, I have a feeling he was also looking at England, realizing that perhaps their empire was falling apart. Nevertheless, he received worldwide acclaim for his book. I mean, people just said this is the greatest thing that's ever been written. They said it was fantastic. Fortunately, most people begin to realize that his thesis was somewhat flawed, because he said that the primary reason the Roman Empire collapsed was because of Christianity, which is absolutely not true. And I think everybody knows that now. But that's where his old deist ideas came into being. So, history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. No, I have not read the 6-volume history and decline and fall of the Roman Empire. I have read a 1-volume condensed version of it, and that's it. So, why did it collapse? Well, there's an old saying. There was a Spanish philosopher by the name of Santillana, and he said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to relive it. And a lot of people say, is that true? Yes, it's true. History is full of lessons which later generations have failed to learn. Classic example. We just withdrew from Afghanistan several months back. You can argue all day long about how we withdrew and if we should have and all this. But the bottom line is, folks, we had been there for 20 years and had not achieved anything worthwhile, lasting anyway, because within a matter of weeks, everything we had achieved, everything we had sacrificed to achieve had been sent back. You know, I won't say we wasted our time and our money and our blood and our treasure, but definitely it didn't work the way we thought it was going to work. This should not have been a surprise. Everybody since Alexander the Great had been trying to conquer Afghanistan. The Russians tried it in the 80s. The British tried it in the 1900s and the 1800s. It's just been one group of people after the other trying to conquer Afghanistan. Nobody has ever done it. Somewhere along the line, somebody is going to look at it and read a history book and figure out you're wasting your time invading Afghanistan. It's not going to work. History indeed does repeat itself. If you don't learn from it, you're going to have to relive it. Now, as we can see, as we saw, Gibbon primarily laid the blame on Christians for the decline of the Roman Empire, and that's been basically discredited now. And there's been other theories popped up since he wrote his book. There's been the environmental public health issues, and there's probably some truth to some of that. There's something called the biological theory, which says that empires are just like an organism. They go through a cycle of life, birth, childhood, adulthood, and decay. Maybe they do, but I think there's got to be reasons that happens. And so, you know, some people just say, hey, it's really simple. They got invaded by barbarians. You know, that was definitely one of the reasons. But we want to look at the underlying causes of why the Roman Empire fell. And there's hundreds of them if you want to go into that. But we're going to kind of basically channel it down into 4 basic areas. There's political reasons, there's social reasons, there are economic reasons, and there are environmental reasons. These are the 4 basic realms of this. And as we look at these, it's you know, not too difficult to look at the world situation we're in today and kind of look at yourself and think, gee, I see a lot of these things going on. And, you know, I'm just with you, you know, as a historian, I look at the world today and I have to think things aren't looking all that great for certain parts of the world. So let's look at Santillana's, you know, concept about those who do not remember the past are condemned to relive it. So political causes for the decline of the Roman Empire. The first one, political succession. The Romans never figured out a way to choose a successor. They just did it hobnob, just whatever fit the whim of the time. And there was never an effective system of succession. You know, this is something that basically the United States has figured out. We probably more than any other nation in modern times has figured out a peaceful transference of power. Usually, polarization of political views, starting with the civil wars of the 1st century in Rome, it became a society of 2 opposing views. Remember, we had the optimates representing the aristocrats, and we had the populares representing the commoners. You can look at our society today and say, boy, we are definitely polarized, are we not? Division of the empire. They finally ended up having to divide it because it got so large. And they never figured out how to rule this large, polyglot, multi-ethnic situation. It became too big and too diverse. The result was that you had the third century crisis, which almost destroyed the empire 200 years earlier. And then you had the problem of disenfranchisement. As the empire grew, larger numbers of people were accepted into the empire who had very little, if any, allegiance to the old Roman values. They felt increasingly disenfranchised and felt government was not responsive to their needs. Just think, do you think we have any disenfranchised people in our country today, or at least people that feel they're disenfranchised? I can guarantee you we do. Political causes. The military became increasingly made up of non-traditional Romans, and thus it became less loyal to the state and more loyal to its local leaders. I don't see this as being much of a problem yet in the United States. The military is still a strong institution for the most part. Some people might not agree with that, but basically it is. Constant wars. The empire was constantly fighting. It was constantly required to trying to defend its borders, to conquer new territories, required more soldiers, which led to him basically bringing people into the army that had no loyalty to their country. Political corruption. The political organization of the empire, including local bureaucrats, provincial leaders, senate, and emperors, became increasingly corrupt, more concerned with political power and personal economic gain rather than governing for the good of the people. I have a feeling that a lot of people out there listening to me probably see this and think, yes, indeed, my government doesn't represent me much anymore. They're too concerned with their own political power. And, this is, and I'm not taking any political point of view here. I'm just saying that a lot of people don't think our politicians today are truly trying to represent the people. They're more concerned of gaining power. Social causes, moral decay. The traditional Roman values that centered around virtue, citizenship, religious values, starting in the reign of Julius Caesar, a sense of moral decay engulfed the state, particularly the aristocratic and ruling cases. Immoral and promiscuous behavior became accepted among the privileged, and even the lower classes became increasingly affected, as evidenced by their religious festivals, which featured sacrifices, lewd acts, promiscuity, and the masses demanded to be entertained. They wanted gladiatorial games and persecutions. It just, it seemed like the moral center of the Roman Empire just absolutely, totally fell apart. Luckily, the Christian church kind of helped with that. Slavery. As the Roman Empire grew, there were fewer Romans to work necessary to run the farms and the small businesses because there just weren't many Romans. So they had to rely upon slaves. Now, we don't have slavery in this country anymore, thank heavens, but we still have disenfranchised people that don't have much loyalty to the state. And they many times are ones responsible for running the farms and the small businesses, the service industries and all. And a lot of them, I think probably don't have a lot of allegiance to the country. Social causes, patriotic decay. Wow, no doubt about that, folks. As the empire increased in size and its leaders became more corrupt, there was a decay of patriotism. Most citizens felt like the government did not exist to solve their problems, and allegiance to the state, a hallmark of the early republic, swiftly declined. There is no doubt in my mind that patriotism has declined in this country. All you have to do is turn on an athletic event and watch people, on their knees and with fists rise to protest the singing of the national anthem. People turning their back. I just, it amazes me when I see that. Emperor worship. As the power of the emperors increased, the participation of emperor worship increased to the point it became normal for the rulers to be looked upon as divine, and it became mandatory for citizens of the empire to sacrifice to them. This in turn became a moral crisis for certain religious minorities, like Christians, who refused to participate in the practice, and this led to the persecutions. However, as the Christian religion grew in spite of the persecutions, the lack of respect for the traditional political and religious leadership increased as well. So I don't know that we have emperor worship in this country. I hope we don't get to the point where we're worshiping a person, as opposed to a religion. But it definitely was a problem in the Roman Empire. Economic causes: growth of the largest states. The backbone of the Roman economy had traditionally been the small citizen farmer, but as the empire grew, fewer people participated in agriculture, and the farms increasingly became owned by the rich. The displaced farmers were forced to move into the cities. I don't know if you know it or not, but by population, only 3% of the American population are classified as agricultural farmers anymore. The largest landowner in America, the largest owner of farms in America, is Bill Gates. He has brought up multi-millions of acres, as a corporate farmer. This is becoming a bigger problem in the long run. Decreased productivity. The large landowners became increasingly dependent upon slaves to run their farms, which in turn led to a reduction in productivity. Now, again, our farms are some of the most productive places in the world. The small farmer does more and gets more out of his land than almost anybody else in any other business. But some people think as the corporate farm rises, that is going to decrease. Right now, it isn't, but somewhere along the line, it may become a problem. Dependence on foreign products. With the decrease in productivity, the empire became more dependent on foreign imports, particularly grain and minerals for the unstable provinces. Try to buy something that's not made in China today, folks. It's difficult. We have become extremely dependent on foreign products. Overspending. As the empire grew, there was an increased need for revenues to pay for the military, whose members demanded more bribes and bonuses to fight, as well as pay for the amusements of the common masses, required increased taxation. The deficit in America is astronomical, and it's just grown almost like a pyramid in the last several years. Some of it because of COVID, and I understand that. That's an emergency. But there's a lot of money being spent that we don't have. That's going to catch us someday. An equitable taxation. The burden of taxation fell increasingly on the poor and the middle classes, with the wealthy paying a smaller share. In addition, provincials were often forced to pay more taxes than Romans, thus leading to a polarization of two groups. You would be amazed if you looked into the statistics of how many corporations pay absolutely zero taxes. None, zero. It's amazing. The dole, the increased reliance on slave labor led to a massive unemployment in the cities. In order to keep the masses happy, emperors decreased the dole, welfare, which led to not only a reduction in the work ethic, but an increased dependence on the government and a sense of entitlement among the poor. I have a sense that we have a very real decrease in work ethic in this country, particularly amongst the younger people. And I also have a sense that we have a much more sense of entitlement, that we are entitled to things than we used to have. I can guarantee you my mom and dad never thought they were entitled to anything except sweat. That's the only thing they thought they were entitled to. As the economy worsened and debt increased, inflation and high cost of goods increased as well, which led to the masses being unable to purchase goods necessary for living. We are going through this right now. Hopefully it won't last forever, but we're in an extremely inflationary period of time right now. And on top of that, you had environmental and public health causes. You had a massive drought that occurred. Before that, from about 200 BC to 150 AD, you had something called the Roman climate optimum, which was basically the Roman Empire was just fantastic. I mean, the climate was just perfect for growing food. And then all of a sudden, a drought began to hit. And then about 160, you had a plague hit called the Antonine Plague, killed 8 million people, probably smallpox. We're not for sure, but that's probably what it seemed like it was. And then the next century, you had another one, which was even worse. It was called the Plague of Cyprian. And we don't know what it was, but we know this: it precipitated the 3rd century crisis and almost collapsed the Roman Empire. It killed so many people. Drought forced the Huns out of the steppes. Remember, the Huns came out of the Black Sea, Caspian Sea area, forcing the barbarians south into Rome. And that had a part to do with it. And if that wasn't bad enough, we went into a little ice age. You know, I hear climate change constantly talked about. Folks, the climate's been changing for a long time. 2,000 years ago, they would have been praying for global warming because they went into something called the little ice age. And, you know, it was a horribly period of time because it basically, you couldn't grow anything because it was so cold. And a lot of it was due to volcanic explosions, which erupted all over the globe and created such a cloud layer that nothing could be grown. And if that wasn't enough, at the end of the Roman Empire, the bubonic plague hit, probably got in from Asia. And man, it was just horrible. And I mean, it killed millions of people clear into the Middle Ages, the notorious Black Death. So, as you can see, there was a lot of things that went on in the last 200 years of the Roman Empire. You can decide for yourself how much of this you see in our own country and see in the world. That's totally everybody's opinion. That's not to say I'm predicting the end of the American, empire. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that, it does seem like there's a cycle of events that are repeating themselves here. And I think the more we are aware of them, the more we might be able to take care of the problems that seem to be building in our country. As we've seen, Constantine built a new capital on the site of old Byzantium. He called it Constantinople. And it lasted. When the Western Roman Empire started falling apart, the Eastern Roman Empire kept going. And it was basically a theocracy. It was a rule by the church. The greatest ruler of the Byzantium Empire was a man by the name of Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 564. And he basically was the one that named it the Byzantine Empire. And it kept going, folks, for 1,000 years. Long after the Roman Empire fell, the Byzantine Empire kept going. He's best remembered as writing down the civil law, which we still use in the Western world today. The Corpus Juris Civilis is the backbone of civil law in the Western world. It still basically makes up the context of civil law. The Byzantine Empire, just like the West, was constantly under pressure, but it kept going and it kept fighting against the Muslim invasions from the south. And the Orthodox Christian Church grew kind of separate from the Western Catholic Church. Finally, in 1054, the Great Schism occurred, where the two religions basically just separated. And the Orthodox Christian Church is still very large in the eastern part of Eastern Europe. The Western Christian Church, of course, is basically the Catholic Church and the Protestants eventually. This all led to the Crusades in the Middle Ages, where the Pope from Rome decided he was going to retake the Holy Lands in the name of Christianity. Didn't work out so well. This is the Blue Mosque, the Hagia Sophia. Justinian built this, and it was one of the great churches, the Byzantine Orthodox Church. It is now a Muslim mosque. They took it over and converted it into a mosque, but it's one of his lasting legacies. So I know I kind of rushed through this. There's a lot of information there, but I felt like you needed to hear this. Now, I hope you tune in next week because we are going to begin our discussion of the history of the Christian church. And we're going to start for a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about the historic Jesus. What does history tell us about Jesus? Remember, I'm putting on my blinders. I'm going to be talking totally about history here. I'm not going to be talking about theology. If you want to know that, you turn into Pastor Dwayne on Wednesdays. He'll do the theological point of view. We are working in collaboration. He knows what I'm saying, and I know what he's saying. So hopefully we won't be against each other here. Okay, Rachel, I'm sorry I had to rush through this kind of.